In the winter of 1596, a Dutch expedition led by explorer Willem Barentsz found itself trapped in Arctic ice, desperate for food. When the crew killed a polar bear, they did what seemed obvious. They cooked and ate everything, including the liver. Within hours, the sailors were vomiting, dizzy, and losing entire layers of skin from their feet. One crew member, Gerrit de Veer, recorded the horror in his journal at the time. They had no idea what had poisoned them. They just knew it nearly killed them. It wasn't bad luck. It was chemistry, and it points to something much bigger than one bad meal. Across almost every culture on Earth, for almost all of human history, people have overwhelmingly eaten herbivores, cows, sheep, deer, rabbits, and mostly avoided the animals that eat meat themselves. Lions, wolves, big cats, wild carnivores in general. That's not a coincidence, and it's not really about danger. The real reasons are written into basic biology, and the pattern goes back much further than Barentz's crew. The evidence is painted directly onto cave walls. At Chauvet Cave in France, home to some of the oldest figurative art ever discovered, roughly 36,000 years old, researchers have found something unexpected. Unlike most other Paleolithic cave art, which is dominated by the animals people actually hunted, horses, bison, reindeer, Chauvet is covered in lions, cave bears, rhinoceroses, and hyenas, the exact predators those same hunters were living alongside. Archaeologists studying the site have pointed out that these weren't the animals filling the cooking fires. They were painted for entirely different reasons: fear, respect, ritual, anything but dinner. Long before anyone understood chemistry, our ancestors seem to have already sorted animals into two very different categories: what you eat and what you honor on a cave wall for reasons that have nothing to do with food. The first hard biological reason is the one that nearly killed Barentz's crew: bioaccumulation. When a toxin or heavy metal exists in the environment, even in a small amount, it doesn't disappear as it moves up the food chain. It concentrates. A plant absorbs a trace amount of a pollutant. A herbivore eats hundreds of those plants over its life and stores a larger dose. A predator eats dozens of those herbivores and inherits the accumulated dose from every one of them. Researchers studying this effect, called biomagnification, have found that animals high on the food chain consistently carry the highest concentrations of mercury and other heavy metals in their ecosystem, which is exactly why doctors advise pregnant women to limit tuna, a fish sitting near the top of the ocean's food chain, while barely worrying about smaller, lower-chain fish like tilapia. Eating a land predator means eating the concentrated toxic history of everything it ever ate. The polar bear's liver takes that same principle to an extreme most people have never heard of. A single half-pound serving can contain around 9 million international units of vitamin A. Acute toxicity in a human sets in at around 300,000 units. That means one modest portion of liver holds roughly 30 times the amount needed to poison an adult. Indigenous Arctic peoples had figured this out long before European explorers arrived and had a strict, specific rule: eat the bear but never the liver. It wasn't a religious rule or a superstition. It was accumulated hard-won knowledge, passed down precisely because someone at some point learned the same lesson Barentz's crew learned the hard way. The second reason is biological risk of a different kind: parasites. Predators don't just accumulate toxins from their prey, they accumulate infections too. The parasite Trichinella, responsible for the disease trichinosis, circulates constantly through carnivorous and omnivorous wild animals. Health authorities specifically list bear, wild boar, walrus, wildcat, fox, and wolf as high-risk sources of infection, and bears remain the single most common source of human trichinosis cases in the United States today. What makes this particularly dangerous is that the usual tricks for making meat safe often don't work here. Standard freezing kills the Trichinella strains found in farmed pork, but certain strains found in wild carnivores are freeze-resistant, meaning a method that makes pork safe does nothing at all to a wolf or a bear. Then there's a much simpler reason, one that has nothing to do with poison or parasites: basic energy economics. Farming an animal for meat means feeding it long enough to grow, and that food has to come from somewhere. A cow converts grass, something humans can't digest anyway, directly into meat. A predator would need to be fed other animals, which themselves needed to be fed and raised first. At every one of those extra steps up the food chain, roughly 90% of the available energy is lost as heat and metabolic waste, a well-established rule in ecology. Raising carnivores for food would mean building an entire second layer of farming just to feed the first layer, a staggeringly inefficient way to produce a meal when herbivores were sitting right there, one trophic level closer to the sun. Even when none of that stops someone, there's still the matter of what predator meat actually tastes like. Diet directly shapes flavor, and the muscle of an animal built built for chasing down prey looks nothing like the muscle of an animal built for standing in a field eating grass all day. Carnivores tend to be leaner, more muscular, and lower in the marbled fat that makes meat tender and rich. People who've genuinely tried bear meat describe it as tough, stringy, and unpredictably gamey, sometimes shifting flavor entirely depending on whether the bear had recently been eating berries or fish. By the time you get to religion and cultural law, you're really looking at the same lessons getting written down and enforced permanently. Jewish dietary law explicitly forbids predatory birds and animals. Islamic dietary law prohibits animals with fangs and talons, which rules out the vast majority of carnivores by definition. These weren't arbitrary rules invented for no reason. They read like the codified version of exactly the same trial and error knowledge that told Arctic hunters to skip the polar bear's liver. Rules built to protecting communities from the same recurring dangers, just formalized into permanent religious law instead of oral tradition. The clearest proof of all this comes from the one place where people had no real choice but to break the rule. In parts of the Arctic, herbivores are scarce enough that Inuit communities have long relied on marine carnivores, seals, walrus, and polar bear meat as genuine dietary staples, not occasional exceptions. And every single one of the risks this script has laid out shows up in exactly the pattern you'd predict. The liver is still avoided, generation after generation. The same ancient caution Barentz's crew never got the chance to learn in time. Trichinosis remains a recognized risk in the region to this day, managed through careful preparation and inherited knowledge about which parts of an animal to trust. And modern science has added a finding nobody could have known centuries ago. A study measuring blood samples from Greenlandic Inuit communities found significantly elevated levels of persistent industrial chemicals, a direct present-day echo of biomagnification, accumulated specifically because their diet still sits one trophic level higher than most of the rest of the world's. Necessity forced an entire culture to live with every one of these risks at once, and their own traditions ended up encoding almost exactly the same precautions science would later confirm. Long before science explained why, evolution had already taught humans the same lesson, one that a Dutch crew learned too late in a frozen Arctic camp in 1596. Some animals are simply better left uneaten.